All right. So thanks everybody for coming this evening. We have Mr. Mike Slaton, who's actually making his second appearance in a class this semester. So I appreciate him donating so much of his time. He met with the 601 class and a lot of students from outside the 601 class as well. To talk about some of his experiences as executive director of the Louisville Pride Foundation and working for the city of Louisville. And now he's going to talk to us tonight with a little bit more focus on grant funding and some of the issues surrounding grant funding. So I've read this previously, but I'll go ahead and read his bio just so you all kind of know where he's coming from. Mike Slaton is the executive director of the Louisville Pride Foundation, a nonprofit organization serving the LGBTQ plus community. The foundation produces the annual Louisville Pride Festival and operates the Louisville Pride Center, which opened in October of 2022. Mike previously worked for Louisville Metro government for 10 years in both the Parks Department and the Office of Management and Budget. During his tenure at Metro, Mike expanded the Adopt a Park program and helped revitalize the Iroquois Amphitheater. Mike helped form the city government's first LGBTQ employee resource group before he left. Before working for the city, Mike was a volunteer and then staff member at the Fairness Campaign, where he was involved in the successful effort to protect school board employees from discrimination based on sexual orientation. Mike received his Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Louisville and a Master of Public Administration from Indiana State University. He is a graduate of St. Francis High School in Louisville. Mike serves on the board of directors at the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky and is the vice chair of the Council of Ambassadors for the Honorable Order of Kentucky Colonels. Mike and his husband Jake were among the first legally married same-sex couples in the state of Kentucky, and they became foster parents in 2018. In addition, they have two dogs, Pepin and Selena. Am I pronouncing that right? Pepin? Is that correct?
Yes, it's
Okay.
Pepin, and I was actually going to introduce him because he's right here, and he
Oh,
may or may
okay.
not make an appearance.
All right. He probably will later. Mike enjoys hiking, studying history, theater, ballet, and jigsaw puzzles. So the way it'll work is I do have some pre-established questions that I had sent Mike ahead of time. So I'm going to kind of lead with a couple of those. And then for the people in the Zoom, if you want to type questions into the chat, I'll take those questions as they come into the chat and pass them on to Mike, and then he can answer them. For those people who are actually physically present in the room, if you want to raise your hand, if you're comfortable saying the question on the mic, you can just say it. Otherwise, you can type questions into the chat too, if you'd rather do that. So with that, we'll move to the first question. So the first thing I wanted to know is, what were your experiences working with grants when you were working for the city of Louisville?
Yeah, and I just want to sort of apologize in advance because it's allergy season here, so I'm probably going to be I'll try to mute my microphone before I cough each time, but it's already starting. So when I was at Metro, I was in the Parks Department in a couple of different roles. I was a volunteer coordinator. I worked with Parks Foundation. I ran the Iroquois Amphitheater, and then I worked in the Office of Management and Budget. I didn't have direct experience with grants as much in that role as I do in my current role. What I did, some of what what I dealt with were sort of internal grants. We had some odd systems where the council people get some discretionary funds, and they can grant to within they can make grants to different organizations or different departments. In my role in the Parks Department, I was often trying to raise money, but I don't want to say it was necessarily discouraged to go look for grants, but the kind of grants that we would be looking for, the $5,000 or $10,000 grants, weren't necessarily the level of bureaucracy and reporting and authorization and everything that we'd have to go through to actually get anything made it really kind of not worth it if you weren't looking for something very large, which was not really kind of the areas I was in. So when I went to the Office of Management and Budget, I was working with 5 or 6 agencies, one of which got a very large federal grant, as well as the city funding, which we dealt with. It was some departments got city funding from general fund dollars. Some departments got federal funds, and to a much smaller extent, state funds. And then we actually had separate areas for both of those. And so I was, at that point, I was not working in the grants department. I would work alongside them, but I was handling more of the general fund dollars, which is a lot easier to track because we weren't as restricted with those as we were with the dollars coming in from HUD or whichever federal department. So unfortunately, that's not the best answer because that's not where most of my experience has been.
Okay, well, that's fine. I just was kind of wanting to make sure I got the municipal side in as well there at the beginning. So in your current position with the Louisville Pride Foundation, what projects have you pursued that have involved the grant funding?
So we've sought grants for a couple of specific projects, and I'll talk about those. And then we also seek them for just general operating support. And I think of grants as kind of falling into probably 4 categories, but maybe sort of 2 sets, because there's also restricted and unrestricted, right? So if we get a grant that says this is for a literacy program, then we can only spend it on that. But some grants are just, hey, we like what you're doing, it's totally unrestricted. So you can think about them in those 2 ways, but then there's also kind of the source of the grant. So on the one hand, you have government grants, federal and state and things like that. And then you have, I think, what I kind of think of as the traditional grants where, you go to a foundation and it has an endowment and you submit an application and there's a board of directors and they review it and award the money. And then there's corporate grants, which are kind of the same way, but are usually like foundations that are tied to a corporation. Like locally, Yum Brands has the Yum Foundation, and they'll have a field of interest that's related to their work. So Yum, for instance, is generally around hunger and increasing access to food. And with corporate foundations, sometimes they work like traditional foundations where it's a competitive, transparent process. And sometimes they're more at the recommendation of employees. So any employee might say, I'm a member of this organization, or I gave you this organization, recommend them for a grant, and then you might get a grant from that foundation, even though your work doesn't necessarily have any much to do with it. And then the 4th category are sort of family foundations and private funds. A lot of donor advised funds fall into this. And so these are things where, a family wealth has accumulated and there's $100 million that is given out, not necessarily through, again, that kind of competitive process, but more just the members of the family. It's totally at their discretion how they want to distribute this money. So all of those can be thought of as grants, and they're all kind of different and different processes. So I think usually when we talk about grants, we're thinking about those kind of traditional foundations. Like we have the Geens Foundation here in Louisville, and we apply, and there's a process, and they come and visit and everything, and we got $20,000 from them this year, and we do a report, and hopefully we get funding again the next year. So projects we've pursued are general operations for the community center, things like that. But also we've looked for small grants for a freezer and refrigerator for our food bank. We've gotten small grants to help with, and when I'm saying small, $5,000, I think that one was, and that was from the Kentucky Colonels. And then we've gotten small grants for launching our business directory and projects like that are kind of very specific and cost $2,000-3,000. We've gotten these larger grants from like the Geens Foundation and groups that are generally more unrestricted, or in our case, it's for our biggest program, which is running a community center. So it's it's virtually unrestricted for us, sort of. And then we just recently have gotten 3 grants, actually, which I'm working on our budget for next year. One is from the Jewish Heritage Fund for Excellence locally, to do a LGBTQ Jewish affinity group, and we're going to hire a project coordinator, and organize some events and things like that. And this is a second one of those affinity groups we've done. We've done a one for Asian American Pacific Islander LGBT people, which was also grant funded. And then we have a very large grant that we've just gotten from the state of Kentucky to do vaccine education, and improve vaccine confidence for COVID, mpox, flu, any vaccine preventable diseases. And that's going to increase our annual budget by like 50%, because our annual budget is about 500,000 in this grant. It's going to be about $250,000 a year. And that's just an enormous, order of magnitude more than we have done in the past. And then we have one grant, which we've gotten for $50,000 for a harm reduction program, kind of, which is going to go along with this immunization education, where we're going to be doing community education, community health workers, things like that, training people around immunization confidence, and then also including this harm reduction piece around drug use and substance use disorder. So it's a wide variety. We didn't really get any grants the first couple of years when we were just the festival and special events, because it's a much harder sell for grant makers. People are not necessarily interested in giving grants to events. What we got were corporate sponsorships, which often took the form of grants. So it might be that the ABC Corporation is giving us a sponsorship, but what is really happening is that a check is coming from the ABC Foundation. And then we've gotten some city grants as well from that. And I mentioned that earlier, that kind of discretionary funding that the city has. We would get some of those for the festival and things like that. But it wasn't until we started opening the community center and working on the community center that we really started to go. We went from zero almost in grants to 20,000, and then 50 and 100, and now next year we're at 250,000, because that's the sort of thing that is attractive to funders, is programs and things like that.
All right, thank you. And again, if people have questions, type them in the chat room, or if you're physically present, just shoot your hand up in the air if you want to ask a question. I'm sure people have more interesting questions than I do in some respects, but I did want to ask next, what were the differences in regard to receiving and managing grants? So when you're in local government versus the nonprofit sector, and I know in the local government you didn't necessarily deal with grants a great deal, but are there differences between government and nonprofits in terms of grant management and getting grants and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the big differences between the nonprofit, at least the small nonprofit, and local government. I don't have to ask anybody to go for a grant. First off, I if it's a big thing that's going to be kind of a change in our mission, I will talk to my board, but I don't have to clear it with anybody. Which in city government, you had to do that for many reasons. Not least of all is that you might be competing with another department. So if if the police department, the fire department is trying to get something, and you're trying to get something, your $10,000 ask might not get approved if there's a much larger ask that's going on. The other thing is the tracking and reporting and everything. At the city, that was all handled by the grants division, and I'm not going to say fraud would be impossible, but it would be a lot of work to misspend those funds. And it would go into a special cost center, and it would be coded. Like if you had a department I mentioned the Human Relations Commission is the one I worked with that had a lot of federal funding. So their budget had all these redundant pages because there'd be a funding for the enforcement division, and it would be enforcement division general fund, enforcement division grant funded, and it was usually kind of each grant kind of had its own fund. So there was this really extensive tracking of what the source of the dollars was, and there were people whose full-time job is to make sure that you're not charging something that's not allowable to that grant. A lot of grants are very particular about food. They never want to feed anybody. Or they'll pay for personnel, but they won't pay for they'll pay for salary, but they won't pay for benefits. Or very often you'll get a grant that pays for a portion of a salary. This large immunization grant is going to pay for 15% of my salary. So, that can be charged to that. So you had a whole team that was there to make sure that all those things happened, and make sure that you were in compliance, and also make sure that you were spending the funding, which with these larger grants is often, can be a challenge. Is that okay? We've spent on this $500,000 grant, we spent 450,000, but there's another 50,000 that we need to spend, or we're going to lose that money. Um, with our nonprofit, um, with the smaller grants, we get a check, and smaller, I mean $15,000, $20,000. We get a check and it goes into our bank account with our other funds. And it's entirely incumbent on me and our bookkeeper and treasurer to monitor and control that money. And there's nobody, we file our taxes, we report to the foundation that gave us the grant, but there's nobody like there was at the city coming back and making sure that everything's okay. So um, it's a there's the accountability is a little bit higher, I guess, on us, that we really need to be on top of that. The only other thing, and then I think in terms of grants, government and nonprofit sector, the government grants have a lot more restrictions generally, and they often are a lot larger. So you're not, the smaller the grant, if there's a lot of restrictions, it's not necessarily worth pursuing it because you end up spending so much time managing it. If you have a $5,000 grant that's going to cost you, $1,500 or $2,000 in staff time between pursuing the grant, getting it, and recording it, then you've actually only got $3,000 net revenue that you can use on your program. And if the program itself costs $5,000 and you didn't budget in for any of those indirect costs, you could actually lose money, so to speak, on that, or just tie up staff time that could be spent on other things. So I know some of the folks in Metro who ran divisions that did receive a lot of grants were generally not interested in looking for anything that wasn't over a certain amount because the labor involved was just made it not a good use of time.
Again, anybody has any questions, jump in. What resources did you use to find grants for different projects? So if you have a specific need, and you've mentioned a few things ranging from like appliances to different kinds of like harm reduction programs and things like that. So if you're looking for grants for, very specific kinds of purposes, where do you start looking for those?
So there's a couple of resources. My current resource is our contract grant writer that I brought on a year or two ago. But there are a couple of websites, databases, and Grant Station, I think is the one that we use the most. There's several, and I probably should have looked some of those up, but they'll have, you'll pay a fee, and it's like $100 a year or something. And then you can go in and you can search for grants by field of interest, a variety of grants that are interested in the LGBT community. You can look for grants by region. So if I'm looking for something in Kentucky or Louisville, or again, that kind of field of interest, if we're doing a food bank, maybe there's somebody that we can ask for funding for that isn't going to fund any of our other programs, but we might be able to ask for that. There's different parameters, and you can do searches, and then you'll get updates. I get a couple that I flagged that I'll get an automatic email in my inbox that their grant cycle is opening, or they've changed their parameters or something like that. There are, lots of resources. I feel like I want to say because there are these big books at the library, and I don't know if they still do that because it's been a minute, but libraries are a great resource for that. One of the easiest ways to find potential funders is to look at other organizations that that are doing similar work and see who's funding them. Anytime I go to an event, I'm looking, at all the names that are on the guest list or the sponsor list or something, or you're watching PBS or something, and they're listing all of the sponsors. They'll include these corporations, and a lot of them, it's just a matter of, okay, well, let me find out about that and going to their website and checking it out to see what they're interested in. Um, and then of course there are professionals. Like I say, we have a grant writer. There's a lot of development professionals who will do this research for you and who will know some of the ins and the outs, that this organization may, yes, they fund that, but they're not really looking for new people, or they only want to fund over a certain amount. Um, with the different foundations, there's usually some rules that are either written and unwritten rules. A lot of times they may have preferences, like they don't want to be your only funder, right? They want to be giving you no more than 20% of your annual budget. Whereas sometimes they want to be the only one. They want to be the big one. They often want to see that they always want to see, of course, that you're going to be sustainable. It's this uh, kind of chicken and egg thing. If you have to show them that you don't need the money, and then you can ask for the money. But they'll be, sometimes they want to fund things a couple of years in a row. Sometimes it's 1 year and then you're out for 2. They'll have all their different official rules, but also just sort of their standards that a grant writer in your community should know that if they've worked with them. But the best thing to do if you have any questions about a funder is to contact them. Any large funders will have a program officer, and it's their job to give that money away, to distribute it, and to answer your questions about it. I called a foundation here that I knew about, but was a lot of these kind of traditional foundations, they sort of can give to whatever they want. It's just there's a board of trustees that's been given this money, and it's kind of their mandate is to improve Louisville or something like that. So it's a very broad mandate. And I talked to one of them a couple of years ago. I remember this, and she said, right now we're looking at education, and that's what the trustees are focused on for the next couple of years. But check back, because our priorities change. So they may move on to sustainability or something else. So checking with those program officers is a great way to see what they might be interested in funding. And you can also generally, either for free or for a small subscription to different services, you can usually get access to the 990 from these different foundations. And that's the tax form that every nonprofit files. And it will list every grant, or maybe it's every grant over a certain amount. But if you're interested in seeing, who did the Community Foundation of Louisville give money to, there'll be pages and pages of this group got 5,000, this group got 350,000. And so you can see that, you can look at that to get a sense of what they might be funding. Or if they're already funding a lot of things in your area, we have other LGBT groups here that we work with. And sometimes, if one of us is getting funding from a group, that probably means the others are not going to get funding, because there's a sense of, okay, well, that's the group we're giving to in that category, so we're going to move on to something else. But yeah, I went a lot further on that question, I think, on finding resources to find grants. But
no, that's an important question, because we've been talking a lot about this is the PA 602 statistics class. That's the class that usually meets during this time. And one of the things that they've been doing as far as assignments is doing discussion boards, where they have their research question, and then they're supposed to be either looking for grants that could potentially be used to fund their research, if they wanted to take it to that level, or looking for articles that have been funded, that have used grant funding to collect the data and things like that. So and for Sustainable Cities, which is a program we're working with this year, the city of Marshall, Illinois, one of the things they want to know is, how can we do a better job of pursuing grants and getting grants, because apparently have a grant writer that's supposed to be helping them, but hasn't been all that helpful the last few years. So they're trying to do a little bit more on their own as far as that goes. So any information you can provide on that topic is useful.
Yeah, well, and let me actually, I want to mention because there's a lot of research grants. That's an area I don't know anything about except when I'm asked to sign a letter of support. And we have a couple of uh, academics in our community that are that are routinely asking for things, and we'll help them if they if they get this grant, we'll help them disseminate it. So it's interesting because I'll sign this letter and then I may never hear anything about whether that came in or not. And then the thing on with grant writers, there's a variety. There's a variety of skills. There's a variety of skill levels, and it sometimes is frustrating because you can feel like you're doing all. It's almost like when you hire somebody to do your taxes, and all they're doing is asking you questions, and you're answering them, and they're filling in the boxes, and it's like, well, gosh, I could have done that. So especially when you start with a grant writer, they don't magically know your program. You're having to provide all of that information, but hopefully then you're building those answers that makes it easier. Um, but it's, it was for us, it was a kind of a big jump to be like, okay, are we going to pay this person like, $5,000 over the course of this year to write some grants? And luckily for our grants program, we secured a $20,000 grant the first year. So it's like, okay, well, we're if we hadn't gotten that one, I might have had a lot more doubt about it.
Just as kind of a follow-up question, you mentioned kind of how if you get a grant, other organizations that are sort of doing similar kinds of work don't get grant funding. So does that kind of competition, does it hinder cooperation or collaboration at all with those groups when you run into situations like that?
I wouldn't say we've encountered it in terms of a hindrance. But we are, every nonprofit is competing for funds with every other nonprofit. Um, and so you're competing for donors, sponsors, and grant makers. Um, Generally, I find with younger folks, there is more of a an abundance mentality where if we, let's try to increase the amount of funding that's available for all of us rather than, fighting over just what's there. I think when I was coming up, I feel like amongst folks who were older in the nonprofit world, there was more of a guarded, this is my funding source and don't you dare try to get it. And I know, and this is just sort of anecdotally, it seems like in my experience with people in my age range and younger, were generally a little more generous about, sharing information and, and it's not a competition for me if you apply for the same grant, even though it sort of is a competition. Um, I think, having said that, I mean, there are with sponsors and with grant makers, there does seem to be, if they're not specifically for us, if it's not specifically an LGBTQ funder, um, it's often the case that more than one organization is not necessarily going to receive funds. So um, I guess it's just a reality of the environment, and we, our organizations kind of communicate about that, and and then sometimes we will often go for grants together, especially for things that one organization may not quite qualify for, or maybe it's a larger grant we can't quite do it alone. So we try to collaborate and cooperate as much as we can, even though it is a competitive environment.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. I appreciate that. Let's see here. The next question I have is describe your most challenging experience applying for grant funding.
I think that would easily be this large state grant that we've gotten. It's been months and months in the making, and spreadsheets and forms and everything, and we would submit it, and then we would get back, well, they don't want to pay for this, and so we would change, make this change, and which is helpful. I mean, I sometimes you send a grant and you get zero feedback other than yes or no, and this was a much more iterative process where we were kind of And it was this kind of ARP money, COVID money coming down. So we're like, oh, let's ask for everything. And then we kind of had to hone it down a little bit. Um, but then, of course, what happens is you sort of, you're like, okay, well, we need this staff person and this staff person. We need 3 staff people. And then they'll come back and say, well, we only want to fund 2. And you say, okay, well, you change that. But then you end up with a program where it's like, well, now we've got all these supplies, but we don't have the staff person to use it. Or, there could be kind of a mismatch. But um, that was a lot of back and forth and then not hearing anything. And we're still actually, we got our approval a few weeks ago. We're still waiting on the actual contract to come through so that we can sign that and actually start receiving the money. So that's been frustrating. It's been quite a learning curve for that. And we wrote the grant, we were assuming we'd be able to start this work in September. So it's like, well, as soon as we get this grant approved, we're going to have to do some kind of budget revision because we've got all these funds we will not have used in September and October. So, but it's, like I say, it's a $500,000 grant, so it's worth a little hassle. I would not, I would have given up on it a long time ago if it had been a much smaller amount.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that they actually gave you feedback during the process as opposed to, because I mean, I've been involved in things where if you get denied, you can go back and ask, well, what could we have done to get a better score or whatever the case is, and they'll give you feedback after, the decision's already been made. But the fact that they were willing to give feedback, as the process was sort of pending is good.
Yeah, no, it was very helpful. And there, I mean, a lot of these groups, it's obviously you want it to be fair and you don't want anybody to have an unfair advantage or anything, but it's shrouded in mystery, like there's who are these grant, like the people getting the funding and giving away the funding are on 2 completely different planets, and nobody really understands each other. I've recently gotten onto 2 boards that do make grants, and so I'm looking forward to learning about more of it from that side and seeing what it's like to kind of be the one looking at those. Not that I'm going to be doing that level, but looking at the applications and making those decisions. I know one of the most educational things in my career was when I started hiring people. And I look at interviews very differently now that I've been on the other side and I've been hiring people. And so, when you start giving away funding, it gives you a different perspective on seeking it and understanding that, this person doesn't know anything about your program except what you've put on that page. And if you didn't explain it well, then they're not going to grasp that this is a really important program. Or if somebody else explained something really well that's not a great program, they're going to get the money instead of you, which can be frustrating when you see some of that. You're like, oh my God, how did they get $75,000 for that?
Um, what tasks and responsibilities are involved with managing the use of grant funding? So, I mean, I think you've already got into that a little bit, but I mean, once you actually have the money, actually, kind of overseeing the spending of it and tracking of it and all that.
Yeah. So each grant will be different in terms of how much it'll have. The freezer and refrigerator one I mentioned earlier, that was a very easy one because we were approved to do that. We went and bought them. We gave them the receipts, and then they reimbursed us the amount that was on the receipts. Getting them successfully delivered was another debacle that took like 8 months, but getting the reimbursement for it was much easier than actually getting the appliances. With the state grant, we're going to be doing a monthly report for them, and which will show where we've spent, how many hours were worked by an employee. A lot of it's going to depend on if it's just paying for supplies and we're turning in receipts. Is this something where we're charging employee time to it and we're tracking that? Or with some of them, with some of the kind of unrestricted grants we get or the general operating grants, we'll get $20,000, $15,000, and then all we really have to do is submit a report within a year saying not necessarily exactly what we spent their money on, but the work that we've done. So they're giving us $20,000 towards a $500,000 budget, and we don't have to tell them exactly what it got spent on, but we can show them what we're doing. Whereas with state grants and things like that, it's like, which stapler did you buy with this grant money? And hopefully you didn't staple any non-programmatic pages with it. And with that one, there's also there's indirect costs with some of these, especially the larger ones. And that is, we put in there salaries and program supplies and advertising for the project and things like that. But they recognize that there's staff time that is spent administering this. Our bookkeeper is going to be doing a lot of work. There's indirect costs. There's things that you incur because you have this grant that they're hard to quantify, and they're hard to record, but it's recognized that it exists. So I think with our state grant, it's 10 or 15% of the cost is considered indirect. So we'll just kind of tell them each month, these were our indirect costs, but we don't necessarily have to show that exactly why, how it was related to the project or something like that. Um, and and then there's tracking it in terms of our accounting software, just making sure that we haven't spent that money, because one of the things that is, when I came to the nonprofit world, I realized I had to actually be responsible for cash management in a way I never was at the city of Louisville. I could spend my entire budget on the first day of the fiscal year at Metro, and I wasn't going to bounce any checks or have any trouble, because Metro's got tens of millions of dollars literally in the bank. Whereas with our nonprofit, we have this funding coming in, and then we have cash flow, that we have to manage with our other events and paying rent and things like that. So, um, whether you set that money aside into a special account or you just account for it separately in your software, there's tracking how you spend it, but also making sure that you don't overspend somewhere else. And they'd be like, well, we don't have enough money to actually do this program. I saw there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, there is. I was just about to. The question is, how does the stress of management differ from public or government setting to the nonprofit organization?
That's a good question. It is different in the nonprofit world. For me, what's stressful is that I'm the final line on everything. I've got to deal with the IT and the HR and cash management, as well as the programming and all of those things. Whereas even in a high level position in a government agency, you're not going to be doing all of those things. You're not going to be, and you're going to have much larger staff to actually implement the individual work. Most nonprofits, if you've got, 4 or 5 people or 10 or 20, you still don't have a lot of people who are, going to go out and necessarily do the work that you're not going to get your hands dirty on it. So I think, for me, the stress in working at Metro government was more about, and I guess kind of the flip side of that is the stress was more about dealing with the bureaucracy and how hard it was to get things done because you had to go through all these channels. But when things were smooth, you didn't have to worry about them. One of the things I find is, with Metro government, the Louisville city government, it's going to operate in perpetuity, right? There's not going to be a time when Metro goes out of business and, packs it up. People might get laid off and might have ups and downs, but, there was this kind of long-term, not necessarily long-term thinking all the time, but this like, we're going to be here doing this, for our lifetimes. Whereas with most nonprofits, unless you have a really strong endowment or something, hopefully you're not struggling to make ends meet month to month or even year to year, but your long-term funding and your long-term prospects are always an issue. Will we have enough money to continue our work next year, 2 years, 3 years? And that's sort of a existentialist threat that, when I was at the parks department, there's always going to be parks. You don't have to work, they might lay me off, they might fire me. I don't have to, worry about that. But, but the fact that like the work is always going to be there. The agency is always going to be there, because you're pulling in tax dollars. So, there's funding. There's always funding crunches in the government, but you don't necessarily have to worry about going out and finding the money. You've got the ability to bring it in.
Right,
I think that's
good, very good question. Thanks. If anybody else has a question, pop it into the chat or just shout at me. Not over Zoom though, because that could get chaotic. So what advice would you give to anyone who might be interested in preparing for a position that would involve either grant writing or grant management or both? What sort of skills, what sort of knowledge should they sort of equip themselves with before going into that position?
I guess one thing is that it's not as mysterious as it kind of seems. I feel like we sort of think of grant writers as being this kind of other thing. And really it's answering questions and telling stories and building relationships. The grants, and I think and knowing how to read and listen to what the funders are looking for. If they're looking to fund a specific type of program and that's not what you do, then you don't want to try to go for that. But if you really look at what they're telling you they're interested in funding, it's easy to kind of build. If your work dovetails with that, it's easy to build a proposal. And generally speaking, they're asking you the questions. You just have to go in and be able to answer the same question 3 times. It's a little bit like applying for jobs where it's just kind of that tediousness. But I think building relationships with the different funders, the program officers at the grant places, different nonprofits, it helps, right? It's a competitive process with most of these places, and it's being done on a fair and equitable process. But it never hurts to have those relationships where you can ask somebody, whether a proposal is going to be received well, or whether you should wait for another year or something. It never hurts to have those kind of relationships, or where somebody's going to give you the benefit of the doubt if you forgot to include a comma somewhere, or added an extra zero to your request. You never know who's going to kind of have the decision about whether to reject you on a technicality or kind of give you a pass. I think if you're really interested in that, volunteering on a board would be a great way. Every board would love to have a grant writer, somebody coming in for free. And even if you say, I've never done it, but I want to try it. And then if you can, we talked about some of the ways you can look for places that give grant, or you can look for the grant makers on these different websites, and you can look at the 990s to see who people are giving to. I don't know this is necessarily as easy to find actual grant applications. But if you have a friend at a nonprofit, you might be able to ask them for some. I've done that with some places when we've been pursuing a grant, and I kind of don't really know, where to start. Ask somebody who got one from them, what they did. But it's volunteering with a nonprofit as a board member or a member of the development committee to help with that would be a great way to learn that. There's a lot of these, or all of them really, I guess, are online now, where you're just submitting things. It's not necessarily anything that you can't do pretty quickly if you've got all your information ready. And there's this pendulum that goes back and forth between sort of asking for a ton of information and asking for a little bit of information. And I think over the last couple of years, we've been moving more towards what some people call trust-based philanthropy, where we're not going to ask you for a ton of information. We're going to, ask you what work you're doing and give you money. And in that case, then the questions are much easier in terms of answering them on these grant applications. I had another thing and I lost it, but so I'll stop there.
All right. Any questions from you guys? Okay, any questions in the Zoom? Um, I was going off of something you said a little while ago, you were talking about, if somebody is offering money, if somebody's offering a grant, but that's not kind of the work that you do, you're not gonna apply to that program. Um, have you ever seen an example of an organization sort of going after a grant because it was available and maybe to put it in its best light, kind of expanding their mission because the money is available. So we'll try to go for this grant because it's being offered, and then we'll do this program even though it's not necessarily what we've typically done.
And the negative side of that is mission creep,
Yeah.
where you look for money that you think is, oh, this is going to be great, and you go and get it, and then you're like, well, now we got all this money, but we got to do this thing that really has nothing to do with our work, and is going to, because of all those indirect costs and things, we got $50,000, but now we got to create a program that's going to cost us like $70,000 to run. And that's definitely something I've seen in different nonprofits. I think a good example is the state grant that we've got for immunization education. That's a whole new thing for us, doing this, healthy health education piece. Now, our work is very much about promoting health and building healthy communities and things like that. So it fits in, and we've structured this grant so that it also supports and kind of folds into some of our other activities. Um, but it is going to be a totally new division for us, that we wouldn't be launching if we weren't for the availability of this funding. So that's, I think it's easy to get kind of um, uh, sidetracked by, or not, that's not the word, but to think about, oh, here's this money, let's go get that, and then not really realize the full cost of what you're going to have to do. That very rarely is a grant going to pay for 100% of the program that you're doing. It's going to pay for a lot of it, but there's going to be those other costs. So if you're not already doing that work and finding sources from other funding, you're that grant is not going to pay for it if you're having to create it out of thin air. um, with some funders, they really want to fund like capital projects. They really want to buy stuff and building improvements and things like that. And it's really tempting to go after something like that, but like if you don't need it, then what you end up doing is asking for something that you start kind of creating a project in order to get this funding, and that's not really a good way to approach it if you don't really need the money. Now, by all means, be creative and let yourself brainstorm. Maybe there's a good project that you could use, but don't just create something just so you get the money. One thing, a lot of times, if you're looking at something that doesn't quite fit you, that's a good place to look for a partner who might qualify for it or might be able to help you with the program. And then you have to figure out, okay, which one of us is going after it, which one is going to get the money and pay the other. And there's a lot of questions that go with that as well. But that's also something that the board of a nonprofit should be keeping an eye on, that we're not going in a whole bunch of different directions at once, or you know getting grants that are we're okay, now we've allocated this employee, we've given a third of their time to 4 different programs. That's not gonna end well.
You mentioned in the last thing you said, you mentioned the board, which you talked about a lot in the previous discussion, but we haven't really talked about it. So to what degree is the board of directors or the board of trustees involved in kind of the grant process? Do they just kind of give their blessing, like, oh yeah, sure, go after that grant, or are they more kind of involved in some ways?
That's going to depend on the organization. For us, up until now, they've been pretty hands off because we've only been seeking smaller grants that are part of our mission, or very very clearly part of our existing programming. So with this larger grant, I did discuss it with them. I didn't bring it up for a vote at any point with them. It was more of a, you know, let me know if you have a problem, sort of, if anybody objects, we can bring this up. But let them know, because it was kind of a departure. um, we only get about 25% of our funding from grants. So I think if we were a purely grant funded organization, or if we were getting big federal grants on a regular basis, we would probably need to have more board oversight. At that point, we'd be getting an audit. We'd be a larger, kind of moving up to another level of accountability and transparency. And so we'd probably have an audit committee that was looking at all of those things. Realistically, most you know boards are not going to have the bandwidth to really be delving down too far into the grants process, because ideally there shouldn't be looking at kind of that granular level of where the spending is. um, but they might be able to help go after some grants will require a letter from the board of directors or a letter from the executive director, just to kind of confirm that the person doing the program has the support, because you could have just kind of an employee go off on their own and get a grant and promise all these matching funds, and the organization hasn't actually committed to them. But I think it's largely the same as the oversight for other spending and programming.
So this is going to be the last question from me, and I saved this to the end so that I can edit this part out, depending on how you answer this. But this is the 602 class, which is the second research methods class. So my final question is, was there anything you learned in either research methods or statistics that has come in handy in regards to either the grant writing, the use of grant writing, or anything else as far as your position goes?
Yes and no. I didn't, at the time I was still working in government, I didn't necessarily think I was going to be going back. So I wasn't taking like the nonprofit track or anything, but I don't remember if it was if I think the most useful thing has been the program evaluation, and that may have been a different class. I may be mixing up here.
It was a different class, but I taught that one too, so that's
okay. But that was how to sort of quantify and track some of these programs. We work with a small population. I mean, the LGBT community is a minority, and it's really hard to get any data on. So funders love data. They always want statistics and data and information. And we have a population that's really hard to get that kind of data on, because, if you do an online survey and 19 people fill it out, like, well, that's not statistically significant. So it's a really challenging kind of uh, thing to deal with in submitting some of these grants. They want to know demographic information and all of these percentages, and it's like, we just don't really have that. We don't have it in a meaningful way. So if I'd been paying attention better, I might have learned the answer to that. But
so just to kind of piggyback off of that question a little bit. So you said that doing surveys and things. So I mean, do you go out and do like interviews, or do you do like interviews or focus groups or anything like that with people to get some information?
we've done a little bit of that. When we started the community center project, the plan was to do several town halls and focus groups, and then COVID happened and it all kind of went out the window. Our festival is our biggest audience each year. We have 10 or 15,000 people there. It's totally free, so people come and go. So we never have a good sense of who's there. But one of the things I've wanted to do is to do a survey, exit survey, exit and entrance survey, um, exit interviews. That's what I'm trying to say, with people as they come to the festival. Unfortunately, I haven't had the time to really kind of do, research into what we're doing takes a lower priority, or it's hard to compete with the more pressing and urgent needs. So we have not been doing as good of a job as we should in terms of gathering that kind of information, because it's important for us to know for program effectiveness, but then also for funders who want to see that. But we do try to ask questions, when we do those surveys of, not just demographics, but then get some, do you feel more connected to the community? And then we could say 92% of people who attended the festival reported that they felt more connected. So it's when you're an executive director, you wear a lot of hats, and the research and policy hat is one that I very rarely get to put on. And that's kind of disappointing sometimes because I like that stuff. And I also like, I think it's really important for us to be analyzing and reflecting on what we're actually doing rather than just kind of doing the same thing over and over. But it takes so much time and energy just to keep doing the same thing over and over that you don't always get a chance to stop and actually evaluate whether it's having an impact or things like that.
Thank you very much. Last call for questions. Anybody in the Zoom? All right. Well, if not, Mike, thanks again for doing this for a second time in like 2 weeks. I appreciate it. Spending a lot of time on Zoom, more than you have to.
My pleasure, and I hope it was helpful.
All right. Well, I appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your evening. We still didn't get to meet your dog, which is unfortunate, but
yeah, he's been sleeping the whole time, which is rare.
That's impressive. So.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.